Okay, welcome back, everybody. It's been a great day so far. It's going to get even better. Congressman Jim Cooper was born and raised in Tennessee. He and Martha, his wife of 27 years, live in Nashville and have 3 children. A New York Times columnist recently called him the House's conscience, a lonely voice for civility in this ugly era, and a tart-tongued moderate who seeks bipartisanship on fiscal matters and other issues in a polarized political climate. USA Today named him one of the brave 38 of a tiny band of heroes in Congress for his work on a bipartisan budget plan. In Congress, he's known for his work on the federal budget, health care, and government reform. Music policy is one of his top priorities, and he has been extensively involved with performance rights and intellectual property issues, which is one of the reasons he's agreed to speak here to us today. He's also a businessman, attorney, and part-time Vanderbilt professor when Congress is not in session. On behalf of the Vanderbilt Journal of Entertainment and Technology Law, I am pleased to introduce Congressman Jim Cooper.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Shane. I'm honored to be with you today, and I'm delighted that my lunch coincides with your lunch. The opportunity to speak to you is somewhat intimidating. There are many top legal experts here at the Symposium, people with vast experience in this field, so I thought that the best way for me to try to add value was to talk about the context in which some of these legislative decisions are made, or more accurately, are supposed to be made. Now, I must warn you in advance, this is a somewhat discouraging topic, and I run into many learned people from all walks of life who almost refuse willfully to understand how degraded Congress has become. But get ready, I'm about to tell you. From an IP standpoint, Lawrence Lessig's departure from the field is widely known, a top expert who grew so discouraged in trying to deal with these issues legislatively that he abandoned the field entirely and has become a focus on political reform. That's kind of astonishing, and it shows the depth of the gridlock in Washington and also the dominance of the special interests. So we have a lot of work to do as we go follow his transition, say, from the future of ideas to his latest book, Republic Lost. So let me try to sketch that, because I think for any decisions to be made or for any of these treaties to be ratified, we somehow have to deal with the political context. The worst insult in politics today involves the word intellectual. And that's sad. You know, I've often advocated competency testing for me and my colleagues, but that would eliminate half the institution, maybe a larger percentage than that. But yet we all know that the greatest store of wealth on the planet is intellectual property. So how do you have a political system that's composed of C students trying to legislate on genius? Because that's where most of the intellectual property is created. That creates an amazing challenge. In Congress, you have only a handful of people who are knowledgeable about IP at all, and some of them are the most vulnerable. We had a test case in California, Southern California, this last election, in which Howard Berman was soundly defeated by Brad Sherman, the famous Berman-Sherman race. It's actually lowered the intellectual capital remaining in Congress. Now, Brad's a fine person in his own right, but not so much in this field. You also have a situation in which there's no career path in Congress or in politics in general in championing these issues. In fact, it's not quite a death sentence, but pretty close to it. Because if you're knowledgeable, you're almost guaranteed to be chewed up by the giant special interests involved, who will crush any opponent. So not many people volunteer for this sort of duty, but to give you an idea, foreign policy in general in Congress is a dead-end career, because, like, who really cares? You can only get in trouble, and the public, if allowed to vote, would eliminate all foreign aid and try to get back a refund for any aid we've ever given. So IP issues are even tougher politically. A good example of the recent firefights, or the SOPA-PIPA fight of last year, that was nothing less than a complete rout. And it's not bad to be defeated. It's another thing to have it be a completely substance-free debate, though. We got tens of thousands of contacts, emails, tweets, things like that, basically accusing us of trying to break the internet. Well, never the intention. like how was the internet about to be broken. There was a lot of fear and some fear-mongering. We had an excellent panel here in Nashville in which one of the top Google attorneys said basically he agreed with 2/3 of the legislation, but no one wanted to get into the details of the legislation enough to understand, you know, which 2/3 they agreed with or which third they disagreed with. About the same time, the Joseph Kony video went viral, and that had almost as much of a following, but also as little understanding. I had people contacting me, you know, really transfixed with the Kony atrocities and things like that, but not really sure where the Congo was. And that's a very passionate but not necessarily informed position. And in terms of American intervention in the Congo, that's an even more difficult question. So trying to legislate in this environment is a very difficult challenge. So I'm going to make 3 fundamental points, each one of which is controversial and discouraging. But I do not want any of this to discourage you from participating and trying to improve the political process, because there are thousands of ways for you to make a difference in your own life, particularly if you're a capable attorney, because in a substance-free environment, we are dying for substance. And each one of you are more than capable of adding to that. You're also capable of influencing your peers, because the definition of politics is really just getting the talk right. And if you spread understanding on these issues, you will be doing yeoman's work. Remember, you have an advantage over anybody in elected office because you're not already tainted. You know, anyone who's already in Congress is down there at 9% approval rating with cockroaches and colonoscopies. So you do not have that handicap like we do. So first major point is this. The real government in Washington is pretty much controlled by special interests. Now, we still have a Congress, and that's a beautiful, important-looking building where the president got inaugurated on Monday. But the permanent government in Washington are really the lobbyists. You know, all those other buildings that aren't government agencies are lobbying enterprises. There are 30 of them for every elected official. According to some counts, even 60 of them. They make much more money than we do. They never have to stand for election. And institutions like, say, the Congressional Country Club, that I get accused of all the time back home as being our gym, is really such an exclusive place that no congressman belong. It should be called the Lobbyist Country Club. And yet we're accused of that being our playpen all the time. So most people now are only running for Congress in order to get one of these lobbying jobs. And the average tenure in Congress is only 6 to 8 years. And very few industries pay as much as one aspect or another. The IP industries, entertainment, and there's a lot of glamour involved. And then they get to stay in Washington for 30 years. There's an association called the Association of Former Members of Congress. The vast, vast majority of those folks continue to live in Washington, D.C. And of the top 10 highest income counties in America today, 3 are in the Washington, D.C. area, and 7 of the top 10. The top 3 are in the Washington, D.C. area, and 7 of the top 10. Basically, folks feeding off the permanent government. So this is not a good trend here. A lot of folks back home don't want to acknowledge that, and they don't want to acknowledge their role, because most of them are paying voluntary dues to make these special interest organizations even stronger. So instead of relying on their elected representative, their senator or congressman, to try to get stuff done for them in Washington, they take the shortcut, pay somebody who will only look out for their interest, have no other regard for the Constitution or for good public policy, and jam it through, get it done. You know, this is kind of an astonishing acknowledgement here, but it shouldn't discourage you. We can still change this. We must change this. But you'd be amazed how many of my colleagues I talk to, and this happens to hit IP issues extraordinarily, because they say, you can't say that. Do you know who's on the other side? They'll kill you. They don't mean physically kill you, but basically cut short, if not eliminate, your career in public life. So this is not a good situation to be in. The second major point is this, unbeknownst to you, but while most of you were growing up, and it's really more your parents' fault than your fault because you were growing up, we no longer have a Congress, period. We have a parliament. And the difference is this, a congressman votes with his party, say, 80% of the time, and admits that 20% of the time, hey, maybe the party's not perfect, not right. In a parliament, you vote with your party 95 to 99% of the time. And if you want any future in your party, you better vote 99% of the time. Otherwise, you are unreliable. Now, that works really well as an organizing metaphor because then you are likely to have troops behind you, if you're the leader, because you can demand performance. But it's not really good for substance because you don't want your troops to know what's in the bill because they might get upset and have opinions of their own. So we are in an incredibly degraded environment in Congress in terms of knowing what we're voting on. One of the classic examples of that is the fiscal cliff vote recently. The New York Times just revealed this Sunday on the front page that a $500 million concession to Amgen, a large biotech company, happened to be included in the bill in a way that not even the smartest lawyer could figure out. No names were mentioned, it's just basically statutory code words. But they got exactly what they wanted, and now they're trying to identify which senators put that in, and senators have this unlimited right to attach irrelevant things to other measures. And it's a log-rolling nightmare. But we have a parliament now, but it's a parliament without a prime minister, so we don't have the competence and accountability of a parliament. We have a parliament that basically is pretty much guaranteed to gridlock, especially on issues involving intellectual property, because such great wealth is involved with intellectual property. The stakes are amazing. Remember years ago a battle on which the Disney company wanted to give a longer life to Mickey Mouse because their property rights were time limited, and that's such a valuable franchise, why not continue that indefinitely? And that pretty much upends the constitutional provision that things should be granted for a limited time only. Why not make it multi-generational? And a legal doctrine that's pretty popular with the current Supreme Court, that corporations are people. And really, if you look at the way things work out, corporations are super people because they have vast resources. This very idea that corporations acquire the rights of American citizens and individuals is astonishing because, as you well know, it's not just free speech. It's many other things in addition. There was even a case this year, should corporations have privacy rights like people? This is kind of an astonishing departure of what most people would think of as be common sense law. So here the real government in Washington are the lobbyists, not the elected officials. And Congress is not even a Congress anymore, we're a parliament. How do you get sensible legislation through a body like that? Now there are various opinions on the Leahy-Smith Act, on American events, on patent reform. That was able to get through, so maybe that's, proving me wrong, but I would say that's more the exception that proves the rule. There are very few things that Congress has been able to handle other than perhaps healthcare reform, and that ended up being extraordinarily controversial. But in a dry and rarefied atmosphere in which there are giant interests on both sides, that makes it very difficult to figure out. Now there is a very popular movement led by young people, and I had the privilege of attending the first Hacking Society meeting in New York with some of the pioneers of the internet, truly inspiring, amazing people, but also internet absolutists that didn't want any concession, any barrier, any rules, anything. And that's a very appealing and pure position, and it's astonishingly powerful among young people because anybody who at all disagrees with them at all can be accused of breaking the internet, and no one wants that. But I represent a community here of songwriters, lots of performers who feel ripped off every time anybody gets a free download. And whether it's Emily White on NPR or anybody else, a whole generation has been raised to think that this is acceptable behavior. It's not really stealing. So we have a huge challenge here. And it's, as we shift business models, as will inevitably have to happen, there are tons of folks who will lose out and tons of folks who will gain. The key is we have to have some sort of new business model that works for creative people. Now, we all know that some people are so creative you can't repress their creativity, but the starving artist model I've never really bought into. Hopefully it'll be an adequately fed artist. You know, you shouldn't have to just rely on the creative instinct alone. But we're having great difficulty coming up with that. We're certainly having great difficulty even thinking about that legislatively, because the way lobbying works in Washington is the past is overrepresented. The future sometimes has no representatives at all, because the future hasn't accumulated enough wealth yet to hire armies of lobbyists to tell Congress what to do. Congressmen who oftentimes on legislation only have a 2-sentence summary of the entire bill. 2 sentences. These are short sentences too. The second sentence tells you how you're supposed to vote. So that's largely substance free. So it really boils down to a 1-sentence description of legislation. And for those of you who may be skeptical, I'd be happy to hand you a whip sheet. We get handed these right before the vote. 1 sentence, what it is. Second sentence, how you are supposed to vote. There are some positions in which the parties don't take formal positions, but usually you know how your leadership wants you to vote. Another aspect of this is that basically committees in Washington don't really work anymore, committees in Congress, because almost every major decision is leadership driven, which is basically poll tested, and then your committee is told what to do. It's figured out in advance for you. So why even be on a committee if that's going to be the outcome? The role for debate and an informed public opinion poll even is somewhat minimal these days. Because take the Ways and Means Committee, for example. A very important committee has the tax writing committee. Guess what, folks? The tax code's pretty complicated. I don't need to tell law students about that. Because whether you've taken individual income tax or corporate income tax or partnership taxation, that's a complicated subject. Well, how many people on the Ways and Means Committee today are knowledgeable about the tax code? That's an embarrassing question to even ask. Because there are hearings, but a colleague of mine on the committee said they really haven't had a substantive discussion in that committee for at least 10 years. You know, that's the honest truth. There's a lot of cover-up and a lot of posturing. I'm important, I'm on that committee, but a classic example is this. Tax expenditures, tax loopholes, are now larger than all appropriations in Congress. So the leakage in the system, just from the Ways and Means Committee, is now greater than all affirmative appropriations, and that includes the entire budget of the Department of Defense. Tax expenditures today are $1.3 trillion a year. These are government programs just like anything else, only they're unacknowledged. Can anyone remind me when was the last year that the Ways and Means Committee even had a hearing on one of these tax expenditures? Of course, this is the way that Amgen and companies like that get their breaks, because the Committee of Jurisdiction really being clueless on what it's supposed to be doing. So when it comes to a complicated issue, IP, that's way more complicated than the tax code, how are you going to get a fair result? Final and tough point is the public will get what it votes for. That's the way a democracy works. And oftentimes the public wants to have its cake and eat it too. You know, budgets, like what's that? You know, what's the downside of, you know, what you're asking for? Because as you all are well aware, many things have side effects. And in my profession, you know, politicians hate to deliver bad news. In fact, that's pretty much the definition of not being a politician, you know, if you deliver bad news. Because since Greek times, people have killed the messenger who brings bad news. And our job is to get reelected, right? So this creates an environment in which it is very tough to tell the truth. A lot of folks are smart in law school, but they don't realize that in Washington, Capitol Hill is the last accounting-free zone left in America. The federal government has deliberately chosen to use only a cash basis of accounting, not accrual. That's A-C-C-R-U-A-L, not cruel, but accrual. So in other words, in plain English, we keep up with our checking account, but not our credit card. Well, why should we keep up with our credit card? Because vital and sacred programs are on the credit card, like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. And yet we're not keeping up with that credit card. And that's not the only issue. Where is the federal government's capital spending budget? And by the way, do we pay any heed to constitutional doctrines like federalism? You know, this is like an astonishing series of lapses that so many people in the public, including my attorney friends, are so accustomed to, they don't even notice their absence. One of the most important documents issued by the federal government came out last Friday. And aside from an op-ed in today's Washington Post, it has not been mentioned by anyone, not even the Wall Street Journal. This is the only government document that happens to use real accounting to describe your government. It's actually written in public company format for anybody who's taken securities law or anything like that. But it's like you own stock in IBM and the CEO has to write you a letter saying why you should continue to own stock in IBM. The first section of this report is Management's Discussion and Analysis, MD&A. Only it's written by the Secretary of Treasury. Here's Tim Geithner himself saying, hey, should you still believe in America? Well, download this report. It's not printed anywhere. There's no press release accompanying it. And see how you feel about your country. Because this uses real accounting. And it's one reason politicians in both parties have completely buried it. You know, we were so caught up with the inauguration. Who was thinking about this? Well, timing is everything. They either issue this report on Christmas Eve or right before the inauguration. But if you're interested in substance, we've got to start figuring some of these things out. Now, this is an opportunity to get real on things and to understand that in an environment in which America is increasingly challenged, and challenged not only in an IP sense, but in many other senses, we've got to start getting our act together. And right now, the country is not showing much signs of doing that. So I hope that with your generation, and I hope with knowledgeable IP scholars, and I hope with powerful interests at stake, there will be more acknowledgement of what we can agree on and what we can get done. The bottom line is this. I hope I've given you a taste of why Larry Lessig was so discouraged and why he has chosen to devote his career now to political reform, not IP reform. Because remember, most of IP reform, as you well know from this symposium, is getting international agreements on these things, not just domestic agreements. But hopefully the United States will be able to lead the way, be able to reconcile these gigantic and monumental interests that can really buy and sell congressmen and senators, and they are doing it on a regular basis. So that we can get the creative community its due, our performers their rights, the business interests that back it all up, a fair shake. But right now, at least in Congress, at least in the Congress of the United States, we're the Parliament of the United States. So when are we going to acknowledge some of these things so that we can make improvements? I don't need to tell you the stress that there is in the community, because I have songwriters here who quote the Ten Commandments, accuse young people of theft. I have young people who don't even know what theft is because they've never paid for anything in their whole life. They feel wrongly accused by an older generation. Fistfights don't always break out, but sometimes it can get very hot indeed. And this is just in my zip code here. So somehow or another, we have to have a system where you don't have to represent Nashville or LA or New York, and you still care about these issues. And right now, we are 3 islands that care in a sea of a nation that wants perpetual free downloads, or at least buy songs a la carte, or at least, not acknowledge the full cost of the old business model. Well, let's welcome a new business model, but what is that? Will it be sustainable? So these are a few of my concerns. I'm sorry to burden you with heavy-duty stuff about political science that sometimes isn't in the textbooks that living politicians don't want to talk about. But I think my job is to try to tell truth to power, and that's one reason I get in trouble a lot. But hopefully some of y'all will focus on some of these issues and also be voices of reason in the debate. Why don't I stop there? I'd be happy to try to field questions or comments.
Representative Cooper, thank you for being here. I have bad news that I'm one of your constituents, and that was the most depressing thing that I can remember hearing in a very long time. I guess my question is that as a practical matter, when you have shall we say, a broadly informed but not a deeply informed electorate that also applies pressure to Congress, as well as that the well-informed and deep-pocketed interest groups do, what's the proper strategy, or what's the reasonable approach that IP experts and other people who see the long game in this can take, perhaps to mirror some of the success of the Coney videos, or to package these things in, for want of a better term, sexier or more attractive ways that get some of that feeling behind it that seems to also move as well as money does?
Well, the most, I think, tweeted about thing that's happened in the last week was whether Beyonce was lip syncing or not. So that kind of generally gives you the idea of how substance-oriented we are. Now, I don't care whether she lip sync or not, because she's still awesome regardless. Like, totally awesome. But in an entertainment culture in which some people have accused us of even entertaining ourselves to death, if you can't rely on law students to be substantive, like, oh my God, we really do have a problem. Now, the key is to, I think, read widely and think caringly, and to keep in mind always some sense of the public good, which I'm worried is lost in this sort of selfish, race. I teach over in the business school, and the Ayn Rand worldview is much more prominent over there than it is here. But still, when a slowly growing economy and these gigantic groups that people feel little kinship with, the liberating freedom of the internet is truly an awesome thing. And just to do a Google search is still, you're dazzled, 0.45 seconds, they'll give you 3 million entries. But the flip side of that is there's a book called The Dumbest Generation, which is about, in which an Emory English professor says that with this magnificent tool, a tool that Einstein or Da Vinci could not even have dreamed of, something like 99% of searches only look at the first page. So why was that bot out there doing all this work for you? So somehow I think to create a larger civic space, we have to have more public dialogue and more awareness and more forgiveness and more sense of moderation so that we can get stuff done. But right now, if you have power, you'll grab yours and devil take the hindmost. That's not a country. So I personally welcome President Obama's emphasis on community in his speech, but that's not enough. You also have to have reality too. Most of life are competing dualities where you have to acknowledge the other with respect and try to work out something that's mutually beneficial. And that's what we're lacking in our parliament today. Anybody else want to bring up? Okay. Yes, sir.
Congressman Cooper, I have two questions. One, what percentage or what number of members of Congress do you think, in their heart of hearts, in their minds of minds, feel like you do? That's the first question. And the second question is, where do I contribute to your re-election campaign?
Well, you're kinder than I deserve. I do think there's a market for the truth, the unvarnished truth. And I'd say the vast majority of my colleagues feel like I do, but they're afraid to say it. Because we get together all the time, and actually the backbenchers, like myself, we get along pretty darn well because we're not on the cameras and we're not chasing the headlines. But then you put a camera down the hallway, and they know that their chance to get on is to be an extremist and to act improperly and lose all their manners, and they'll choose that path. And the same thing happens with journalists, because unless you're pigeonholable, There's not really a spot for you. You have to be left or right. The media has difficulty handling moderation today. So most people end up like I do, and we're called bad television because we make the host feel bad, or the audience feel bad, or we're not, our views aren't predictable all the time. We actually try to think about the substance, and nothing is more boring than substance. And we don't get to vote on ideas. We get to vote on specific pieces of legislation, and sometimes they're monstrously complicated. And they'll put in 263 good items and 492 bad items, and then we're supposed to balance that. But of course, they want that log rolling so that there'll be no accountability. You cannot determine today, for example, who's a fiscal conservative or who's a fiscal liberal, because the votes are so mixed up, we can spin it any way we want to. In fact, the old congressional quarterly paradigm is gone. The little paragraph in the newspaper every week, how your representatives voted, doesn't matter anymore. The only measure left for Congress is attendance. So if you show up a bunch of times, people think you're working hard. This entire last year, your Congress of the United States only met for 44 full days. That's less than the Tennessee legislature. And we run the world's only superpower. And how much time was devoted to intellectual property issues in that? People don't even want to be on the committee of jurisdiction concerning IP, judiciary, because it's a committee about abortion and other social issues. IP barely gets much mention at all. Now, there are good staff members in the background working, and there are a few caring members. But a classic example would be Rick Boucher from Virginia, who was getting very senior on judiciary. He was defeated by a NASCAR driver. It's like, this is amazing. Like, any political consultant who told you, like, if you're starting out and just got elected, doesn't matter how big your majority was, you're going to devote your time to IP issues, unless you're from one of these magic zip codes in Nashville, LA, or New York, you are dead. And even some of us from one of these zip codes. So that's the challenge. We get the government we vote for. And people care about very different things than perhaps they should. Yes?
But I do wonder, facing all of this, I think we all feel, you're joking about that depression, but it's hard to see a way out, and I wonder what motivates you to continue.
Well, on the bright side, we live in the greatest nation on earth or in the history of the world. I'm the luckiest person in history because I get to serve on the board of directors of that nation. And I know, because I see it every day, the incredibly talented people in this country who deserve better than they're getting. And why not make that opportunity available to them? There's never been more chance for improvement than there is today. So the idea that anybody could be discouraged is like totally wrong. We have an opportunity to rebuild this nation in a new and better way on solid foundations, using real numbers and real substance, because we got the brain power to do it. But what we are missing is the creative class has largely abandoned politics for several generations now. The best people in America in the late 1700s were probably named James Madison and John Adams and folks like that. The best people in America today, you will never see their names or faces in the political pages. So this self-selection away from the messy process that I'm in, but we politicians, we build barriers against it. We make it so that you're in all your privacy if you join what we do. Your portfolios not only disclosed, but hashed through if you have any portfolio. So that ends up being most of the folks in Congress, people who really can't get a job anywhere else. And, and they stay the longest because the lobbying firms don't want to pick them up yet. But the hot young folks, 5 or 6 years, once they get their federal pension, boom, K Street. And they'll use their inside knowledge to prey on the American taxpayer and the American citizen, defending antique industries that really need a new business model, but the new businesses haven't had a time to accumulate enough net worth yet. So see, that's the challenge, is to go ahead and give the future a voice. You respect the past, but give the future an opportunity to speak, and that's what old-fashioned legislators used to do. But see, we can bring this back. The Constitution's still there. We've just chosen to ignore many parts of it. And they left so many holes that it's enabled the wily folks, like Newt Gingrich is one of my least favorites, to basically alter this whole paradigm. You know, John Boehner, give him credit, this last few weeks has allowed the House to work its will for the first time in 2 decades, where it passes with a bipartisan majority. Because many people are aware of the Senate and its filibuster, and that's kind of old hat. How many people realize that the majority of the majority rule in the House of Representatives is almost tantamount to a filibuster? Because that's basically minority rule. If you're in the majority party and you're a majority of that party, then you 120 people in the House of Representatives pretty much control the entire agenda if you happen to have a magic R after your name. That is wrong, and that needs to be changed, and there are some signs that this year it's starting to change. I probably need to get you back to your proper intellectual property duties. I have great respect for the experts you're hearing from today. These are monumentally important topics, and I just hope that one day we'll be able to get their voices more loudly heard in the halls of Congress. And so that, for example, when you testify at a hearing, it's not just for the cameras, and IP hearings seldom are unless they're giant interest clashing. And you never want to be on a second panel of a congressional hearing because there are literally no members left, except the 2 who are obligated to be there just to keep the lights on. But the amount of time that Congress spends to have a substantive hearing is almost gone, because we really only meet 1 day a week now. And that's Wednesday. And that's the day that all our constituents come to Washington to ask for stuff. So if you're not meeting with your constituents, then they think you don't love them anymore, and that means you can't go to your hearing. Well, why did we have a hearing? Try to learn something. And when we only meet 44 full days a year, as we did this last year, how much time is allocated to some of the important issues of the day? You know, this is astonishing. But this is what the American people have voted for. You know, it is amazing. So let's do what we can while we can, armed with your law degrees and with your knowledge, and hopefully with your caring hearts, fix this thing. Okay? Thanks for letting me come.